January 29th, 1945, 2:47 in the afternoon, Holtzheim, Belgium. The fighting in the village has mostly moved on. Snow covers the yards and roofs, pressed flat by boots and tracked vehicles. The air is quiet enough that individual voices carry. A first sergeant walks around the corner of a farmhouse and stops. In front of him are German soldiers, dozens of them, some already holding rifles, others reaching down to lift weapons from a pile on the ground. 4 American soldiers are kneeling in the snow, their hands behind their heads, their weapons gone. 20 minutes ago, the Germans in this yard were prisoners, captured during the assault on the village, and guarded by 4 men, because that was all the company could spare. Now the situation has inverted. The Germans are free, armed, and organizing. An officer steps forward and presses a submachine gun into the sergeant's stomach. He shouts in German. The sergeant does not understand the words, but the meaning is obvious. Around him are roughly 90 enemy soldiers. Behind him are scattered American troops clearing houses, unaware of what is forming here. If these Germans attack from the rear, the company will be hit while spread thin. There will be no warning. There will be no defense. The arithmetic is simple. 1 man, disarmed allies, a gun at point-blank range, and an enemy force preparing to move. There is no version of this situation that ends well. And then, instead of complying, the sergeant begins to laugh.
On paper, there is nothing about this situation that suggests survival. The sergeant is not an officer, and he does not command a unit large enough to alter the balance. He is not reinforced, not supported by armor or artillery, and not positioned to receive help. Numerically, the disparity is decisive. Roughly 90 German soldiers are present in the yard. Even if only half are armed, that still represents dozens of weapons within a few meters, all oriented toward a single point. Any sudden movement should be met with immediate fire. There is no meaningful cover, no concealment, and no distance to absorb reaction time. The Americans nearby are not positioned to intervene. Most of the company is dispersed through the village, clearing houses room by room, focused forward rather than behind. They cannot see the farmhouse yard, and they cannot hear what is happening there. The 4 guards assigned to the prisoners are already neutralized. They are kneeling in the snow, disarmed and surrounded. Their presence does not alter the situation, it reinforces it. From a tactical perspective, the German officer controls every variable that matters. He controls the space, the numbers, and the initiative. The standard response in this situation is compliance, followed by captivity, followed by whatever captivity means at this stage of the war. There are personal constraints as well. The sergeant is not physically imposing. He is older than many of the paratroopers around him and has already been under continuous combat strain for months. Fatigue and cold are not temporary conditions. They are constants. Training does not resolve this. Experience does not resolve this. Discipline alone does not resolve it either. Every conventional decision model leads to the same conclusion. The correct action is surrender. Any attempt to resist should fail immediately, and any attempt to seize control should be detected before it begins. Nothing in the environment favors initiative. Nothing in the geometry allows recovery. Nothing in the sequence suggests a mistake large enough to exploit. If this moment were reconstructed on a map board or written into a field manual, it would not be labeled difficult or unlikely. It would be labeled unwinnable. Which is why what follows cannot be explained by advantage or preparation. It can only be explained by what happens when a decision is made inside a space where failure has already been assumed.
The sergeant did not arrive at this moment by accident. By January of 1945, he had already been moving through combat for months, across different countries, under different conditions, with very little margin for recovery. He was not new to pressure. He was not unfamiliar with isolation.
He had entered the army before airborne forces were fully established, volunteering at a time when the concept itself was still experimental. Jumping behind enemy lines was not yet routine. It was treated as a calculated risk, bordering on expendable. Airborne training filtered aggressively. Physical conditioning eliminated many candidates early. Those who remained were pushed through repeated stress exposure designed to produce automatic responses under fatigue. By the time training ended, hesitation was treated as a liability. When he deployed, he was not assigned to a rear area role. He moved with infantry elements whose missions depended on speed and fragmentation. Units were expected to land scattered, reorganize without orders, and operate with incomplete information. During earlier operations, he had already experienced separation from his unit, already navigated unfamiliar terrain without reliable communication, already made movement decisions based on probability rather than certainty. He had also operated while injured, continuing to move despite damage that would normally remove a soldier from the line, not because of resilience as a concept, but because the operational situation did not allow substitution. Leadership followed function rather than rank. When direction was absent, he provided it. When coordination failed, he simplified objectives and acted. None of this made him exceptional in isolation. Thousands of paratroopers carried similar histories. What distinguished him was not intensity, but consistency. He had learned to process information without urgency, to observe before reacting, to wait for a moment when movement mattered more than speed. Repeated exposure to high-risk environments had removed novelty from danger. This does not reduce risk, it reduces distraction. By the time he reached the village in Belgium, his decisions were shaped by pattern recognition rather than emotion. He did not evaluate situations by how extreme they appeared. He evaluated them by whether they contained variables that could still move. In the farmhouse yard, most of the variables were already fixed. Numbers, distance, and weapons favored the Germans, but not every factor was static. The officer issuing orders, the posture of the men, the brief pause created by expectation. These were not advantages, they were conditions, and conditions, under pressure, are sometimes enough. Let the broader context matter, because it defines what surrender meant by the winter of 1944. In December, the German offensive in the Ardennes had broken through thin American lines. Entire units were overrun. Thousands of soldiers were captured in rapid succession, often by formations moving faster than rear area procedures could adapt. This was not an abstract concern. News moved quickly along the front. Stories were repeated, condensed, and stripped of detail until only the conclusion remained. Prisoners were not always returned. In one incident, American soldiers who had already surrendered were gathered in an open field and fired upon at close range. Those who survived did so by remaining motionless in the snow until darkness. By the time the reports circulated, the distinction between rumor and confirmation no longer mattered. What mattered was expectation. From that point forward, captivity could no longer be treated as a stable outcome. It became another uncertainty, one with no control once initiated. For men still in contact, this altered decision-making. It did not create recklessness. It removed a fallback. By January, the sergeant had already moved through campaigns where improvisation replaced planning. Normandy had scattered units across miles of hostile terrain. Holland had demonstrated how quickly airborne forces could be isolated and reduced when relief was delayed. Each operation reinforced the same lesson. Formal structure degrades under pressure. Decisions revert to the individual. By the time Company C reached the Belgian village, manpower was already depleted. Losses had removed key leaders. Replacements were limited. Administrative personnel had been reassigned forward to fill gaps. This was not a unit operating at full strength. It was a unit maintaining momentum with what remained. The assault on the village reflected that reality. Limited numbers, compressed timelines, minimal reserve. When prisoners were taken, the priority was speed, not security. The yard behind the farmhouse was selected because it was available, not because it was defensible. 4 guards were assigned because 4 guards were all that could be spared. Every decision before the moment in the yard was shaped by scarcity. The German patrol that approached the farmhouse exploited this. White camouflage reduced recognition. Winter conditions flattened silhouettes. At close range, distinction disappeared. Once the guards were disarmed, the situation escalated rapidly. Weapons were redistributed. Orders were issued. Positions were identified. This was not disorder. It was reorganization. By the time the sergeant returned to check on the prisoners, the Germans were no longer reacting. They were preparing. From his position, the consequences extended beyond his own survival. If the Germans moved as planned, the attack would come from inside the perimeter. American troops clearing houses would be engaged from behind, without warning. That outcome did not require speculation. It required time. And time was the one variable still in motion. The German officer assumed compliance because compliance was the norm. He expected hesitation. He expected fear. That expectation created a pause. In a situation where surrender no longer guaranteed survival and resistance appeared impossible, the decision space collapsed to a single question. Not whether the action would succeed, but whether inaction guaranteed failure.
By the time the sergeant stood in the yard, the situation had already closed around him. The Germans were no longer reacting to discovery. They were arranging themselves for movement. Men clustered near the weapons pile. Others shifted toward positions that controlled exits and sight lines. The officer issuing orders was not hurried. He did not need to be. From a numerical standpoint, the imbalance was decisive. Approximately 90 enemy soldiers were present. Even allowing for incomplete armament, the ratio exceeded anything considered survivable in close contact. Distance offered no buffer. The nearest German was within arm's reach. The farthest was still close enough to fire accurately without adjustment. There was no meaningful cover. The farmhouse walls were behind the Germans, not in front of them. The yard itself was open, flat, and bounded. Movement options were theoretical at best. Turning to run would expose the back. Reaching for a weapon would be observed. Speaking would change nothing. The 4 American guards could not intervene. They were positioned low, disarmed, and surrounded. Any attempt by them to move independently would be isolated and suppressed. Even if the sergeant were allowed to surrender fully, the outcome remained uncertain. Processing prisoners required time. Time was limited. The Germans were preparing to move before higher command could intervene. From the German perspective, the logic was clean. Eliminate interference, regain initiative, strike the enemy from behind. From the American perspective, the logic collapsed. There was no maneuver left, no reinforcement pending, no signal to send. Every traditional response pathway was blocked. In such situations, planning gives way to arithmetic. Doctrine replaces probability. The probability of survival through compliance was low. The probability of survival through resistance was lower. But there was a difference. Compliance preserved the German plan. Resistance disrupted it. Disruption did not need to succeed fully. It only needed to fracture coordination long enough to change the sequence. The officer pressing the weapon forward was focused on authority, not mechanics. His attention was fixed on expectation. He believed the moment was resolved. That belief created a brief structural weakness, not in numbers, not in firepower, in assumption. The yard had become a closed system, but
but not a static one. The Germans believed control had already been achieved. They were transitioning from capture to execution of intent. That transition carried friction. In most circumstances, friction favors the larger force. Here, it created delay. Delay was not safety. It was opportunity measured in seconds. In a space where no option offered survival, the only remaining variable was timing. Not whether to act, but when.
The shift begins without announcement. What appears to be compliance is treated as compliance. The sergeant's movement is slow, deliberate, consistent with expectation. His hand rises toward the sling of his submachine gun. The officer watches closely, but without urgency. This is the posture he anticipates. The weapon is carried in the standard airborne position, accessible but not immediately threatening, designed to be lowered, not raised. The distance between them is minimal, less than a meter. The transition occurs in a single sequence. There is no pause between grasp and motion, no adjustment after alignment. The first burst is directed at the officer. At this range, the effect is immediate. The officer collapses before command can be reasserted. The sound changes the geometry of the yard. Men who were stationary move without coordination. Some turn toward the source, others hesitate. The submachine gun continues to cycle. Short bursts, controlled sweep. This is not aimed fire in the traditional sense. It is suppression at point-blank distance. The objective is not elimination, it is disruption. A magazine is expended. The replacement is automatic. Muscle memory compresses the action into seconds. At the same time, verbal commands are issued. Simple, directional. The kneeling Americans move. Weapons are seized from the ground. The balance shifts from zero to contested. The yard fractures into individual reactions. Some German soldiers attempt to respond. Others retreat. Several drop their weapons entirely. Fire is returned. A soldier beside the sergeant falls. The engagement tightens rather than expands. The second magazine is not fully expended. It does not need to be. Within less than a minute, the structure dissolves. Coordination is lost. Authority is absent. The remaining Germans disengage by instinct. Weapons are discarded. Hands are raised. The sequence ends as abruptly as it began. The yard, moments earlier organized for attack, returns to containment. Smoke drifts in the cold air. Movement slows. What remains is not silence, but control. Not because the situation was resolved cleanly, but because speed overtook expectation. The transition back to order is uneven. The immediate threat has passed, but the environment remains unstable. Men move cautiously. Weapons are kept raised. No one assumes finality. Those who remain standing are gathered and repositioned. Additional guards are assigned as they become available. The yard is resecured with more attention than before. The Germans who surrendered again do so without resistance. Some are wounded, others are disoriented. None attempt to reassert control. The surrounding elements of the company begin to consolidate. Clearing operations resume, but with adjusted spacing and awareness. What had been routine minutes earlier now carries a different weight. The incident is reported upward as a contact, not as an anomaly. There is no attempt to frame it as exceptional. It is logged as an engagement that occurred under pressure. From a command perspective, the outcome is functional. The village remains secured. The rear is not compromised. The company maintains cohesion. The cost is not ignored. One American soldier has been lost. Others are shaken, but capable of continuing. There is no pause for reflection. The operational timeline does not allow it. The front continues to move. Only later, as reports are compared and accounts aligned, does the structure of the event become clear. The scale of imbalance, the speed of resolution, the consequences avoided rather than the damage inflicted. What stands out is not the violence itself,
It is the re-establishment of control in a situation that had already tipped beyond recovery. The yard behind the farmhouse does not become a landmark. There is no marker placed in the snow. By the next movement, it is just another position passed through. For the men involved, the sequence is not retold immediately. There is nothing to emphasize, no lesson extracted on the spot. The unit moves forward, carrying only the adjustment that matters. Prisoners are guarded differently. Rear spaces are treated as exposed. The system adapts. Control does not return all at once. It returns in fragments, through procedure, spacing, and silence. And then the war continues.
In retrospect, the moment in the farmhouse yard resists simplification. It is often described as improbable, or instinctive, or driven by temperament. Those descriptions explain very little. What occurred was not the result of superior strength, advantage, or preparation for that specific situation. It emerged from a narrowing of options until only one form of agency remained. By the winter of 1945, surrender was no longer a stable endpoint. It had become another variable, one that removed control rather than preserved it. In that environment, decisions were shaped less by survival in the abstract and more by consequence. The sergeant did not alter the numbers. He did not change the terrain. He did not gain reinforcement. What changed was sequence. The assumption that the moment had ended created a pause. The pause created exposure. The exposure was used. Nothing about the outcome suggests inevitability. The margin was measured in seconds. The structure could have collapsed in any direction. What remains instructive is not the action itself, but the condition under which it occurred. A closed system, a completed plan, a force transitioning from control to execution. In that space, disruption mattered more than success. Breaking coordination mattered more than endurance. Acting mattered more than choosing correctly. Afterward, the war continued without reference to the yard behind the farmhouse. The front moved. The records were filed. The unit adjusted its procedures and advanced. The moment did not change the conflict. It did not need to. It simply prevented one outcome from becoming final. In a war defined by momentum and collapse, that was sometimes enough.